Economists have been fearing the worst for the US economy over the past several months. But fortunately, those fears have not been borne out. The US has not tipped into a recession as has been expected. But right now, there are some indicators that show that a recession is possibly imminent for the US. Analysts have wrung their hands at some wild action that the US bond market saw last week. What exactly is happening, and why should India be worried? Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. The US bond markets have seen a rout the last week. This is an indication that investors do not feel optimistic about the US economy going forward. But before we look to the future, let's look at the past few months as to how that economy has performed. Coming off the pandemic, the US economy has been resilient so far. It's evident by very recent job numbers. Job additions have been healthy. Because of these trends, observers expect the Federal Reserve in the US to keep benchmark interest rates high in an effort to control inflation. But if the trendsetter for the world, the US, does that, emerging markets like India may not have too much choice but to follow suit. And why would we do that? Because if we don't, then investors who are anyway looking for a safe haven like the US in these uncertain economic conditions would say that interest rates in the US are going higher and higher up, so let me go there. So in order to maintain the differential, emerging markets like India would start increasing benchmark interest rates. But if we do that, then all of our loans, or auto loans, personal loans, home loans, and industrial loans are all linked to the benchmark interest rates in one way or the other. So those would start going up, which is not a great economic indicator for us. So the US economy continuing to stay resilient is one possibility, and there are related problems as we've just seen. But what if the US tips into recession? That's a whole new problem. That will mean that global trade, including for India with the rest of the world, will actually be affected. Let's take a look at how much India exports to the rest of the world. For the year ended March 2023, India exported $770 billion worth of goods and services, which is about a 14% growth from the previous year. But the good news ends there. Worryingly, with the global economy looking gloomy, our goods exports dipped to $172 billion in the period April to August this year. This compares with about $196 billion in the year earlier period. Services did show some growth from 126 to 133 billion in the same period. But with the prospects for the IT services industry looking pretty glum, the chances that overall services would at least be able to maintain the same pace of growth that we saw last year are pretty slim. Remember that the IT services industry contributes to about 60% of all services exports, and the sector contributes to about 7% of India's GDP. Now, if you're wondering how much the US accounted for in India's export trade, that country accounted for about $118 billion in India's exports in 2022. If that figure starts looking shaky, then our entire trade numbers will start looking very different, telling upon our economic prospects. Now that we've set the context, that is, as to how much India depends on the rest of the world, and specifically the US, for trade and economic growth, let's take a look at what is happening in the US and why we should be worried. Like we saw earlier in this episode, there have been several predictions, dire warnings that the US will tip into recession soon, this month, this year, and so on. But fortunately, that has not happened so far. But what is causing alarm is the action that was seen in the bond markets, specifically on interest rates on bonds, or what are called as bond yields. Like all governments, the US government too issues bonds to raise funds and offers interest on these bonds till maturity. It's much like your fixed deposit with banks on which you earn interest. The difference here is that the government bonds can be traded in the market and command a certain price. If the bond prices dip, then the interest on these bonds or these bond yields go up, and vice versa. If the prices go up, then the bond yields come down. Typically, a 10-year bond earns higher interest than a 2-year bond. Again, think of it like your fixed deposits. Why would you lock up your money for a longer duration and earn lesser interest compared to, say, a 2-year bond saying, I can get back my principal faster and earn higher interest in the interim? But every time that the US has tipped into recession these past few decades, at least the last 8 times that it has done so, there has been an inversion, which means that the bond yield on the 10-year bond has been lower than that for the 2-year bond. Even though this yield inversion trend has persisted in the US for several months now, that country has not tipped into a recession. So much so that the person who first propounded this theory that the inversion precedes a recession, Professor Harvey Campbell of Duke University, told Bloomberg in January that maybe this time around his theory may not work. That there may be an inversion, but maybe the country won't go into a recession, that it probably have a soft landing. But now, looks like he's changing his mind. He feels that a recession in the US is imminent because the Federal Reserve has held on to rates too high for too long. To top it all, JP Morgan predicts a washout for the IT services sector for this year 2023-24. Closer home, Zoho, a software products major from India, has sounded a word of caution, saying that it is seeing a slowdown across countries in which it sells and across products. In a tweet, CEO Sridhar Vembu said, "I suspect the global economy is taking a turn for the worse. Caution ahead." For further clarity, we spoke to Bloomberg senior editor markets John Authers, whose newsletter captured recent trends in the US bond market succinctly. Let's hear what he has to say. Mr. Authers, thank you for being with us today. Truly appreciate it. First off, what do you think the US Federal Reserve ought to have done or ought not to have done to avoid finding itself where it is now?
It's always easy to be wise after the event, obviously, which and the Fed didn't have the opportunity to do that because it was operating in real time. If you assume that the pandemic happens and that the initial response happens, both of which I think you have to do. We're human; these things will occasion extreme events will happen, and they have to be responded to. I think the biggest mistake that is beginning to emerge was just leaving rates as low as they were for as long as they did. There was not unreasonably, because none of us knew how the pandemic was going to pan out. There was this belief that we were due for that there was going to be further risk of a decline, that the economy had to be jolted back into life somehow, and therefore rates stayed on the floor throughout 2021. If you look across the emerging world, Mexico, next door to the US, started hiking rates in the summer of 2021. Doesn't have as strong an economy as the US, but that gives you an idea of where people where the move was going in terms of inflation taking off. So that would have been the single greatest reason to do that. If they had hiked earlier, then it's possible that the lagged effect would be less. Milton Friedman says monetary policy acts with a lag, and that it wouldn't have been necessary to hike as far as they did.
Could rising US bond yields actually help destabilize emerging market flows? For example, in the case of India, the Indian bond market was included in the JP Morgan bond index recently. That means that India would expect an inflow of funds. And the more the funds come in, the more stable that the bond yields become. Which means with US bond yields rising, the differential between Indian and US yields become lesser and lesser. So will that mean that investors will actually flee emerging markets like India and saying, anyway, I'm looking for a safe haven, US bond yields are rising, so let me go there and invest?
In the long term, I'm not a great expert on India. I do write a lot about emerging markets. I used to be based in Mexico. So I'm not going to comment too specifically on your great country. In general, this is one of the reasons I am most concerned that rates might eventually come down in a very great hurry, is that when the dollar is strong, that tends to put pressure on emerging markets. Now, again, that's weakened compared to the era of the Latin American crises and then the Asian crises in the 90s. But the basic fact still remains that there is a lot of dollar-denominated debt, less than there was proportionally, but a lot of it still, and a stronger dollar makes it more expensive to repay it. And that is a problem for lots of people across the emerging markets. I don't believe this affects the rupee as much as some other currencies. But the carry trade, the notion that if you want to get money from somewhere. One of the ways to do it is to borrow in a low-yielding currency. The yen still, interest rates in the yen in Japan are still negative, and park it in a country like Mexico, for example, which currently still has overnight rates above 10%. That in many ways cannot be sustainable.
In sum, that leaves us with a lot of macroeconomic data points that we can ponder over and worry about. But before we go away, let's look at our Did You Know and quiz sections. Did you know that loans that were transferable to others appeared as early as in ancient Mesopotamia, where debts denominated in units of grain weight could be exchanged among debtors? The recorded history of debt instruments dates back to 2400 BC via a clay tablet discovered at Nippur, or in present-day Iraq. This artifact cites a guarantee for payment of grain and the consequences if the debt was not repaid, according to Investopedia.com. More recently, the Bank of England, the world's oldest central bank, was established to raise money to rebuild the British Navy in the 17th century through bonds. Some records place this date at 1693. For this week's quiz question, you may recall that we referred to yield inversion preceding a recession earlier in this episode. What else happens just before a country tips into a recession? This is related to yield inversion, and the clue is, if you Google for John Authors and Bloomberg, you'll find it in his article. And before you think we've forgotten about the answer to last week's question, here goes. The question was, how much do you think are women paid lesser than men for the same job? The gender wage gap, according to the UN Women Organization, is estimated to be 23%. That means that women earn 77% of what men earn for the same job. Though these figures understate the real extent of gender pay gaps, particularly in developing countries where informal self-employment is prevalent. Women also face the motherhood wage penalty, which increases as the number of children a woman has increases. That's all we have for you in this episode, but before you go away, do not forget to like, share and subscribe, and importantly, click on the bell icon. Till we meet again, have a lovely week ahead.